the South Carolina Educational Television Network.
How it happened that Egyptians came to the Peloponnese, and what they did to make themselves kings in that part of Greece has been chronicled by other writers. I will add nothing, therefore, but proceed to mention some points which no one else has yet touched upon.
Good evening and welcome to For the People. Mention the civilization of ancient Greece and most of us automatically think of science, philosophy, and mathematics. But is this image of Greece true to her real history? And more importantly, how is the image of the ancient Greeks as the creators of science and philosophy being used to bolster and perpetuate racism? We'll explore these and many other questions in this one-hour live call-in special with Dr. Martin Gardner Bernal, author of Black Athena, The Afro-Asiatic Roots of Classical Civilization. For 9 years, Dr. Bernal was a fellow at King's College, Cambridge University. Dr. Bernal earned the PhD in Oriental Studies at the same university. He is currently a professor of government studies at Cornell University. Incidentally, Dr. Bernal is the grandson of Sir Alan Gardner, who deciphered the earliest Semitic alphabets and wrote the standard Egyptian grammar book. Dr. Bernal, what impact has the image of Greece as the place of origin of mathematics, science, and philosophy had on racism and education?
I think the image of Greece has had an enormous impact on racism. I remember when I was young, I spent some time in southern Africa, in what are now Malawi and Zimbabwe. And there, the common thing for enlightened white liberals was to say, well, the Africans are coming on fine, but they need 2,000 years of civilization to reach our level. And I think by that, they had in the depths of their minds the idea of Plato and Aristotle. That was the 2,000 years which whites had behind them and blacks didn't. More crudely, the extreme right-wing group headed by a French intellectual called Alain de Benoist, which is in France, he's extreme right, has somehow chosen the name Grèce, which is the French for Greece, as the word for his right-wing intellectual group. The idea of Greece as a pure, white, creative civilization has been extraordinarily useful for racism. Now, I remember as a child, when I started reading books on the Greek heroes and things like that, I felt a sort of comfort. Here were people doing exciting and adventurous things who were somehow connected to me, that I was somehow like the Greeks, they were like me. And the implication of all I read was that they were whites, looking more or less like I did. I know, talking to black students, that they get exactly the opposite feeling, that the Greeks are somehow not like them, that a friend of mine, brilliant man, was told by his philosophy teacher on the first day of college that all philosophy runs between Socrates and Nietzsche. There is no other philosophy worth talking about. And that meant that he, as an Afro-American, felt shut out from civilization, because the real core of civilization was Greece and Northern Europe, and therefore no one else in the world could share in it.
Specifically, what are some of the mathematical and philosophical concepts that have been attributed to the Greeks?
Well, the Greeks are supposed to have, I mean, in loose thinking, people say the Greeks were the first to make astronomical predictions, the first to make geometrical theorems, the first mechanics, a whole lot, the first doctors, a whole lot of scientific things, the first to invent metaphysics. Aristotle was the first to invent logic. A whole gamut of scientific and philosophical things are attributed to the Greeks as creators. And that seems to me exaggerated. I mean, I'm not in any way denying massive Greek achievements, but they came from the even more massive achievements of the Near Eastern civilizations, particularly Egypt.
Okay, let's get to that later. How old is Greek civilization?
Well, it's difficult to say when you begin it, because as Plato reported, Egyptian priests told Solon, the great legislator of Athens, that the Greeks always had to start again, that they had disasters which wiped them out and they had to start again. But I would say Greece began about, as we know, it began about 1600 BC. And then it was overwhelmed by a series of catastrophes and then restarted about 750 BC.
Okay, now to your book, Black Athena, the Afro-Asiatic Roots of Classical Civilization. How has the image of Greece changed over the last 2,000 years?
Well, it's changed very fundamentally in that the classical writers, people like Herodotus, you quoted when we started, had a very clear image that the Greeks had been living there in at a rather primitive level, and along had come Egyptians and Phoenicians. Phoenicians are the people who lived on the Levant in present Lebanon. And these people had set up cities and had civilized the Greeks, had taught them irrigation, new weapons, how the alphabet, how to write. A whole series of things were attributed to these Egyptian and Phoenician colonizers. And then later Greeks were supposed to have gone to Egypt to study, to improve on their knowledge of Egyptian culture. So you have this double thing. You have the colonization in the Bronze Age, which we'd put in the middle of the second millennium, the millennium from 2000 to 1000 BC. And then you have in the first millennium BC, Greeks studying in Egypt and bringing back their wisdom or their learning to Greece. So you have sort of a two-tier system of borrowings by the Greeks from the Egyptians.
Okay, but how has it changed over the...
Well, sorry, back to the original thing. Okay, so you have the this idea which I've called the ancient model in my thing, which is Greece is the result of this two-tier borrowing from the Near East. Now that lasted amazingly long. It lasted until about 1800 AD.
So until 1800 AD.
Yes. If you talk to anybody living in the 17th or 18th century ADs, this is European scholars among others, they would have said the Greeks were great people because they preserved some part of the wisdom of the Orient. And they had learned from the Egyptians and they had transmitted this wisdom on to later ages, and they should be given the credit for that. This was the image of Greece as the first European country, the oldest European country. And it had been the oldest to be civilized because it had been close to the much older civilizations of the Near East.
Okay, we want to examine how this change in image came about.
So,
but go ahead.
Okay, well then you get an attack on this ancient model, particularly on the colonizing, but also on the idea of the Greek students, and a discrediting of all the ancient testimony saying that these things had taken place. So you get the irony that as the Greeks are being raised as the first creative people, the first artists, the first philosophers, the first mathematicians, you simultaneously get the Greeks as historians being denigrated because they couldn't...
Being put down.
Being put down. They could not be trusted with their own history because they said that they had borrowed from the Egyptians.
This is what the later scholars were saying.
The later scholars said the Greeks were wonderful at everything except for history.
Yeah.
History they couldn't be trusted on. So you have this sort of, you attack the Greeks as historians as you build them up as everything else. So you have in the 1820s, which was a particularly conservative period, it was a period after the defeat of the French Revolution, you have a building up, an attack on the ancient model, and in the 1830s and 40s, you have a building up of what I call the Aryan model.
Okay, let's get to that a little bit later.
Okay,
on.
sure.
How old is Egyptian civilization?
Well, Egyptian civilization certainly goes back to the 4th millennium. That's the 3000s BC. So it is, 2,000 years older than Greek civilization.
Specifically, what were some of the major achievements of Egypt when her population was primarily African?
Well, her achievements were massive. I mean, first of all, the economic and social balance of this very large country, a prosperous country. Then you get the architectural triumphs, the very sophisticated mathematics required to back up this. You get very strong traditions indicating that a lot of Egyptian philosophy and Egyptian medicine was formed at a very early stage in Egyptian history.
Okay.
That is,
you brought some slides with you.
Yes.
The question of who the Egyptians were, racially speaking. Could you address that, please?
well, Egypt is in Africa, there's no question. Egypt is an African
Now, you
country.
say Egypt is in Africa, but you know, I can talk to a lot of people and have talked to a lot of people. We went to Egypt.
Oh, you went to the conference there? Yeah.
In July. And someone asked, you know, were you going to do something on African civilization? Well, why are you going to Egypt? I mean, they were honest.
I've seen maps in which Egypt has been cut out of.
Right. So it is a real consideration, subject, or concern, rather. But racially speaking, who were the ancient Egyptians?
Well, I mean, they lived in Egypt. The language they spoke was a language which seems to have developed in Ethiopia and Kenya, part of the great Afro-Asiatic language family. And most of the formation of Egypt seems to have happened in Upper Egypt or on the Nubian frontier of Egypt or beyond. That Upper Egyptians unified the country, and it seems to have had a dominating role in various key periods of its history. The population were black, but that doesn't mean they look like West Africans. Some did, some didn't, but Africa, as the homeland of mankind, has more varied types than almost any other continent. But the Egyptian basic population was East African, but there were some Middle or West African types in the population. I mean, it's very difficult when one gets into the technicalities of it.
And we're talking about what period? The early period?
We're talking about the Old Kingdom and the Middle Kingdom.
Which dates back to?
The Old Kingdom dates back, well, there's controversy about this. I would accept the traditional date of 3,250 BC.
All right.
And that period, you get a higher proportion in the representations of people looking black by any
Well, let's go to
standard.
the slides if you...
Okay, well, in fact, the lady we have now, Queen Tai, who is the mother of the famous King Akhenaten, is in the New Kingdom. And I think I'd better bring out that there's been a tendency among Egyptologists when they see a black in ancient Egypt to say that's a servant, that's somebody low down in the social scale. This isn't true. It so happens that a large number of the most powerful dynasties originated in the south of the country and therefore were black. The first dynasty, as I mentioned, the 11th dynasty, which founded the Middle Kingdom, and the 12th dynasty, which was probably the greatest dynasty in Egyptian history, and the 18th dynasty, to which Queen Tai belongs.
And she was a powerful...
She was a powerful lady in her own right.
In an earlier program, you mentioned that at some point the Greeks were paying tribute to her, I think you said.
They were certainly paying tribute, or people from the Aegean were certainly paying tribute to her husband, and we've now seen that her daughter-in-law, Queen Nefertiti, was sending envoys, or seems to have been sending envoys to the Aegean, or people with high authority. So there's no question that Greece was in relations with Egypt, and those relations were of a subordinate to a superior, whether it was sovereignty or suzerainty. Okay, well, let's look at another. Well, here is Akhenaten himself, the famous heretic king, supposedly the founder of monotheism, a very important and interesting figure. We know quite a lot about him. And we can tell his face because it was a period of realistic representation. It wasn't a period in which people were represented formally.
But you've had European scholars to say all kinds of things about the physiognomy or
Oh, he's supposed to be diseased. There's some physical... And to back them, they do have... There is the problem of his body, which does look a bit strange. But his face reminds me of a number of friends I have. I won't go into names. This is a 12th dynasty pharaoh. Then we have the famous Senwosret I, known to the Greeks as Sesostris, who was a very major conqueror. Actually, I'm doing some work on him at present, and I'm now convinced that his armies reached Turkey and probably Bulgaria, and perhaps beyond.
The significance of this being what?
Oh, in a large number of ways. First of all, Herodotus and the Greeks say this about Sesostris, and in fact, the 19th century scholars have said it's totally absurd for an Egyptian pharaoh to have conquered that far, and the Egyptians must be vainglorious or must be boasting or imaginative and confused when they described these conquests. So that it's very important as a backup for what the Greeks said. And you could, I mean, if the most absurd thing they said seems to have some historical backing, then you should believe a lot else of what they say.
Okay.
It's also interesting how 19th century scholars found it very difficult to believe that an African king could conquer large areas of the Near East, that they're perfectly happy to have Persians or Greeks do it, but for an African to do it is somehow
What do you
upsetting.
think is at the base of that, is at the bottom of that, the reason that the idea that an African
Well,
is able to...
Africans are inferior in so many ways in the white vision, but the two key ways are they're incapable of thought and philosophy, and the other way is that they're incapable of strong action. They're not manly in that way, and therefore the image of an African in the 19th and early 20th century was somebody who was essentially passive, both mentally and physically, and therefore the idea, I mean, they had short spells of savagery, but sustained, organized conquests were believed to be beyond the capacity of Africans. And certainly when it came, maybe they could conquer each other, but they couldn't conquer non-African populations, that they were at the bottom of the hierarchy of human populations.
Okay, any other...
Yes, well, let's look at a few more. Here's his descendant, Senwosret III, in the same 12th dynasty. Here's just another Egyptian type, and you see the sort of mixed things with definite black, well, West African black characteristics. Here is a very interesting king, Mentuhotep, one of the main pharaohs of the 11th dynasty before Sesostris, and they seem to me to have established very close relations with Crete and with Cyprus, and to be represented in Greek mythology by the king Rhadamanthus, who was supposed to have brought law and order to a number of the Greek islands. So you have Mentuhotep as a very important thing, and he came from the south of Egypt, and there's no reason to doubt this.
Okay, I think that's it. Now, what were, once again, some of the achievements of these African Egyptians?
Well, it's difficult to know the extent. If you accept what the Greeks say about them, they were the founders of philosophy. The earliest Greek references to philosophy are to Egyptian philosophy. Now, of course, philosophy is a very slippery concept. You're not quite sure what you mean and what you don't mean by it. But certainly the Greek writers, and I see no reason why they should have boosted the Egyptians, accepted that they were the first philosophers. They were also considered as extraordinary astronomers. And the first Greek to forecast a solar eclipse, Thales, had traveled to Egypt. And there seems no reason to doubt that he had taken Egyptian observations. It takes about 400 years of observations to predict a solar eclipse. And you don't just do it off the top of your head. Even if it is a brilliant European head, you can't do that. So that you have, it is clear he was using data of a very sophisticated kind, which must have come from Egypt.
Okay, now...
He didn't go to Mesopotamia.
Okay, now, let's try to get to the root of this thing. Outline for us, if you will, why, how, and under what circumstances did the Greeks get this new image as the creators of science, philosophy, etc.?
Well, it's a complicated story, and it's taken a lot of pages to tell in my book. But the chief component is that the Greeks, by the middle of the 1700s, the 18th century, were being thought of as the childhood of Europe as a whole, Europe as a continent. And this was a period in which racism was growing enormously, and childhood was meant to represent the future of the child, and therefore later European civilization. And it was also a great period in belief of ethnicity and purity. And therefore Greece had to be a pure white country. And therefore there was considerable distaste for this notion of Egyptian conquest or Semitic conquest and later impact, that Greece had to be pure. It took them 70 years to free themselves of the classical authority that said otherwise. I mean, it was very difficult because there were so many classical sources that said, look, the Egyptians were here, and this explains that, and that explains this, that it made such sense. But yet you can feel the scholars and popular writers in Northern Europe in the late 18th century really under the strain of this image of Greece receiving its civilization from people who they now knew to be racially inferior. So you have this pressure. And in the 1820s, you get a systematic attempt by the new German scholarship just to disregard the Greeks as historians and to say, it's not true, we can believe ourselves that the Greeks were pure Europeans, and this, they had a great help from linguistics, which was showing in the 1820s and 1830s that Greek is fundamentally an Indo-European language. So you get the beginning of the idea that somehow Indo-European speakers, or Aryans, and they slipped very easily from language to race, had moved into Greece. But the only way they could imagine them moving into Greece was as conquerors. They couldn't imagine them having settled there as wandering tribes, or coming in some way that they knew, and of course they knew because European experience in the 18th and 19th century was of Europeans dominating all other peoples, and they projected that image back into the past. So you have this idea that the Greeks must have come into Greece from the north, just as the Germanic tribes had come into the Roman Empire at the end of the Roman Empire, or the Aryans had come into India there. But in both those cases, we know from history and legend that it actually happened. In the case of Greece, there was no evidence to suggest that northern tribes had invaded and conquered anybody at that stage. And this was a problem.
Okay.
But they decided just to do without it and rely on modern racial and linguistic science.
Okay. So up until the early, 1800s?
No, 1840s.
1840s.
Yeah.
Everybody was saying what about the origins of Greece?
Oh, up until the 1820s, everybody was saying the Greeks were colonized and civilized by Egyptians and Phoenicians.
Okay, then what happened, and who were the movers and shakers, to use a contemporary term?
They were German and English scholars. And they started the attack. I mean, the particular university, which I think was crucial in this move, was the University of Göttingen in central Germany, but it had very close connections to England because it was under the same rule. The same King of Hanover ruled England. And this university really produced the scholarship which was able to overthrow the model. It was also the university to produce the first systematic racism, and it was a pioneering university at the end of the 18th century.
You said that this university has served as the model for later universities.
It was the first one in which you had separate departments with their own journals, developing their own jargons, and a seminar as a teaching technique, a whole series of things that's now become standard, certainly in America and over the rest of the world, started really in Göttingen and offshoots of Göttingen.
What year are we talking about?
We're talking about the development in Göttingen, 1770s, 1780s. It then became institutionalized in Prussia, that's the kingdom that formed the basis of Germany, in the 18-teens, 1820s.
Okay.
Yeah. So you have this. And so at the same time that you have the new scholarship saying that Greece is essentially a European country and was never affected by Egyptians, you have this being institutionalized by the gymnasium in Germany, which focused its attention on contemplating the Greeks. The Greeks had now become a miracle people. They had become a people who were poetic and had all the advantages of youth and epic poetry, the Greece of Homer, the Greece of vitality. At the same time, as the inventors of philosophy, they were supposed to have the advantages of maturity. So one people combined both sets of virtues, and they were white. And so it was a conscious effort by German educators to say contemplation of these perfect people would produce integrated human beings for a new non-revolutionary Germany. It was a very conscious way of avoiding the traumas that France had been through in the French Revolution by looking at the Greeks. And the same was taken up by the English public school system, and Dr. Arnold was very consciously working for the middle, to reform without revolution, using classics and Greece, but this classics had to be race, and the new thing to their history was scientific method, they called, which was using footnotes and things like that, but the new principle they was using, they called the ethnic principle, which was racism, and that was the core to the new historiography or writing of history in Northern Europe in the early 19th century.
Okay, let's get to these two. Okay, let's get to these two models for the origins of Greek civilization. The ancient model, as you call it, which says what?
The ancient model says that Egyptians and Phoenicians came, I mean, you read part of it, came to Greece, colonized it, and later generations of Greece went to Egypt and Phoenicia to study. So you have cultural influences coming in two ways, by the colonizers and then by the Greek students bringing back wisdom with them. And
okay, and this later model from the early, 1800s?
Early 1800s, the
Says
Aryan
what?
model says that Greece is the result of a conquest from the north of people we don't know much about, we call the pre-Hellenes, the pre-Hellenic people. All you know about the pre-Hellenic people is that they were white, that is, they were not Egyptians and they were not Semites, but at the same time, they were non-Indo-European speaking. Now that's essential because half the vocabulary of Greek is not Indo-European. Indo-European is a language family that includes nearly all the European languages and Iranian and North Indian languages. And this is a group of families that are clearly related to each other and they have a lot of structure and a lot of vocabulary in common. Greek is an odd man out in the system. There's a lot else. Therefore, the new proponents of the Aryan model said the reason why there is so much that is not Greek, not Indo-European in Greek, is that the pre-Hellenes culture survived. And so that it was mixed linguistically but not mixed racially, that the pre-Hellenes had been white. So you got over the inevitable mixing of language, but the Greeks were seen as lily white,
Okay.
and marble helps.
Okay, now this ancient African model for the origins of Greek civilization says what about the time of contact, that is, the Africans making contact with the Greeks?
They say that the Egyptians and Phoenicians, I mean, they're different chronographies, as they call
Okay.
it, that is, different datings, arrived about 1580 BC. And other ones arrived later. But there were various settlements. When you come to the students going to Egypt, they start going in the 500s BC, the 6th century BC, maybe some a bit earlier, and that's much more detailed. We have great, you know how Plato went or how Solon went and things like that to Egypt, and ancient historians said they studied with so and so, and there's quite a lot of detail about that. The stories of colonizations are much more muddy because they came from this earlier period, and there'd been a crisis between the early period and the later one.
When the Africans in Egypt went to Greece, how were the people living in Greece?
It's difficult to tell. The Greeks' own reports are that they were living in a very primitive way. They were living off acorns, is the common image given, which was accepted by 18th century historians. Archaeology doesn't tolerate that. Archaeology shows that Greece in the early Bronze Age had a fairly sophisticated society, a fairly prosperous society. That too, I think, had been influenced from the Near East. I think there's no doubt about it, but we can't track that down in terms of language. But the Middle Bronze Age was a very low period in Greek culture and was something like this.
Okay, now, the proponents of the Aryan or white model for the origins of Greek civilization, who were they and what were their motivation?
Well, they saw this.
I'm going to have to ask you about Professor Blumenbach.
Well, Professor Blumenbach is a complicated case, but well, let me try and think. In Göttingen, there was Professor Heine, who was a dominating figure, who was very interested in the non-European world, but was convinced in the racial superiority of Europeans, and the belief that the Caucasians were the original race and the perfect race from which other races had fallen off, that the blacks had gone to Africa and blackened and become wrong in that way, the Mongols had gone off to Asia and become distorted in that way, that the true original type of man was the white Caucasian. And this was common in Göttingen at the time, and in fact it was systematized by Blumenbach. But other people like Meiners, a whole series of those scholars, were equally hierarchical in that. But Blumenbach is a very interesting case because he wrote the standard racial textbook, which was used for the next 100 years, talking about the three basic human races, the white, the black, and the yellow, and how the white was superior. But he had a very curious experience after having written this book and made his reputation, got his chair on the grounds of it. He was traveling in Switzerland when he suddenly encountered a beautiful black woman with whom he seems to have fallen in love. And you get a complete change in his personal attitude. And he starts saying, well, some blacks are intelligent, some blacks are worth it. And in fact, collected a few histories of blacks who had done well in Europe. But the impact he had was as the writer of his standard textbook, which tried to give anatomical backing to the racism and to say that skin color had something to do with moral and other physical attributes. I mean, the fact that he personally changed is very interesting for me, sort of way, but it's not important.
Okay, and he coined...
He coined the word Caucasian. He used it in his third edition of his work in 1795. And the idea of the Caucasus being the home was partly because the Georgians were supposed to be models of white people, good Georgian, not the Georgians here, but the Georgians in Russia, or what's now Russia.
Okay.
But also because there was the idea of the sons of Japhet in the Bible, who were identified with the Aryans, had settled in that area. You know, the Ark was supposed to have landed on Mount Ararat, south of the Caucasus.
Okay.
And so you have that, whereas the sons of Ham went to Africa and the sons of Shem went to Mesopotamia and Asia.
Well, you know, I have outlined how I want to handle this thing, this program.
Sure.
I'm already, they're telling me that we're getting calls from Washington, D.C.
Oh, I see.
And I have a whole lot of other questions I want to ask you. But I think we'll take a call from Washington. For the people, you're on the air.
Hello. Isn't it true that the mystery of Helen of Troy has never really been solved in the respect that Troy has never been found? And the mystery of Agamemnon and the troops and so forth and the invasions has never really been solved. Why isn't it possible that that whole thing could have revolved around an African experience?
Okay. Can you give us some background on that and answer the question, please?
Well, I think the point of the question, as I understand it, was that sometimes Greek myths get it wrong. And therefore the fact that the Greeks say a thing happened doesn't necessarily make it so. Troy is a debatable subject. I think 90% of scholars would say that they have found the site of Troy. There's some difference on which Troy, there were 7 cities built one on top of another, was besieged by Agamemnon. And it's quite clear that the poets, the epic poems we have of Homer, include elements from a number of different periods, both before and after the time of the siege of Troy, about 1200 BC. I think the period of skepticism about the Trojan War is over. In the 1920s and 30s, you'd get a significant number of scholars who would say there was no Trojan War, it's all nonsense. The tendency now, and I suppose I'm part of it, is to take stories seriously as working hypotheses. You want to try and find other evidence to back them. You shouldn't take them on face value without external evidence, but they're very useful as indicators of what happened. And in fact, Schliemann, the excavator of Troy, used Homer and Pausanias, a Greek guidebook of the 2nd century AD.
Okay, now for the person sitting home who didn't go to Cornell or Cambridge,
I'm sorry.
What is the significance of this?
Well, the significance of it is that the Greeks do sometimes get historical things wrong. But the evidence in favor of Egyptian and Phoenician settlement, I mean, the attestation of reports of Egyptian and Phoenician settlement is so widespread among the later Greeks, and there is nothing in the archaeological record against it, and I think, in fact, there are several things for it, so that I think one should trust the Greeks as far as this is concerned. But everything I'm saying is based on competitive plausibility rather than certainty.
Okay, well, let's take a call from South Carolina. For the people, you're on the air. For the people, you're on the air. All right, you're not on the air. Let's talk about what the Greeks learned from the African Egyptians. philosophy. Could you give us some specifics on that?
Well, I mean, the one thing that the Greeks all attributed to the Egyptians was the invention of the idea of the soul. I've been talking about a theological, philosophical concept, that it occurs in Socrates as portrayed by Plato. But the idea of a soul, the idea of metempsychosis, that is the soul traveling from one body to another, is clearly around, at least in late Egyptian thought. At a more strictly philosophical level, you seem to get notions of an ideal world of numbers and of pure, perpetual beings, a world of the gods, which involves intellectual concepts, as opposed to the world of becoming, a world in which things grow and fade and grow up. And that you get in the so-called Memphite theology, which is a text that dates back to 2700 BC, something like that. You get very, very old things. So a lot of metaphysics that I think you can trace back.
Okay, let's take some calls. Washington or South Carolina. You're on the air.
Hello.
You're on the air. Good afternoon. How are you?
Fine. I'm a student at University of South Carolina, and I'm in the art department. And my question was that where could I attain a book with some of the information that your speaker is talking about? I did take art history, which some of the dynasties that he's talking about was fully covered. The instructor that they have at University of South Carolina is very good. I enjoyed this class and everything. But I just would like to do some type of research on my own.
That goes. Hold up. Thank you. We got you.
Well, I don't know how much help it'll be in art history specifically. I mean, my book, Black Athena, this is the American edition, which is coming out next month, deals with the subject as a whole. If you look in the American Journal of Archaeology in the early 80s, there are a couple of articles which I found very interesting, which are computerized studies of the Kouroi, the earliest Greek statues. Now, for many years, these are the basis of Greek figurative sculpture. For many years, scholars have noticed that they have resemblances to Egyptian figures in their hairstyle, the fact that they put the left foot forward. But these were felt just to be things that sculptors could have picked up on a quick visit to Egypt. However, these recent studies are showing by computerized study of the proportions of the limbs to each other, the head to the body, things like that, that Greeks must have studied in Egyptian studios to do this, that there's no way you could casually pick up. They were following the second Egyptian canon of sculpture. So they were very precise borrowings. This is dealing with the 6th century BC. So there are particular things in art history which I think are very much worthwhile following up.
Okay, let's take a quick call from the greater Washington area. For the people, you're on the air.
Hello?
You're on the air.
I would like to... I don't know whether I'm supposed to be talking to you nuts, but I wanted to know about, have you ever heard of a history about our ancestors of Europe? Our ancestors of...
Have we ever heard of a history about our ancestors?
Of Europe.
Our meaning what? Our ancestors. Africans? What are you talking about? I don't understand what you're saying.
It was a book that I studied in school.
Uh-huh.
And our teacher was a history class, and she brought a book in, said, Our Ancestors of Europe. And it's similar to some of the things that they are saying on this program.
Oh, okay, thank you very much.
Thank you.
All right.
I don't know which book you're referring to. I mean, the standard histories of mankind now, those by Richard Leakey, talk about the African origin of mankind, and therefore the first Europeans, like the first everyone else, came from Africa. And there are some interesting old Stone Age figures of women which look very African. The Journal of African Civilizations did a special issue on Africans in Europe in the, it came out in 1985, and that has some interesting material in it on that subject. But I'm afraid I don't know the exact book you're referring to.
Okay. In the area of science, what did the Greeks get from the Africans in Egypt? Briefly, if you could.
Briefly, okay. Well, I think if
You
you're
wouldn't
talking
believe
about
we have about 15 minutes left. Go ahead.
geometry, and I think Archimedes' screw, which is a mechanical way of raising water, that a whole lot of irrigation techniques seem to have come from Egypt. And medicine, there's no question that the Hippocratic texts of Greek medicine are very strongly influenced by Egyptian medical texts.
Wasn't Hippocrates the father of medicine?
That's what we were always told, yeah. But there's no doubt that even, you know, some formulae are the same in the treatment, that there's a very, very substantial Egyptian influence in the Greek medical line, so that in architecture, of course, there's very close. This actually we might show.
Okay, for the slide.
If you can get back to the Parthenon. Now, where do you think this is? Actually, it comes from Saqqara in Egypt, beautiful fluted columns, which were built over 2,000 years before the Parthenon. And you get, that's a later style, but let's see if we get back to those. Here again, you get very elegant Egyptian columns, so that architecturally as well as artistically, there's no doubt that Egypt had a very profound effect. A number of scholars will still try and say that the Egyptian columns had no influence on the fact that the Greeks produced very much the same thing. And this is not to deny the exquisite beauty of Greek architecture, but it is very closely related to that of Egypt. In fact, the one thing lacking in Egyptian architecture is the arch, and that's lacking in Greek architecture too.
Okay. This question, and all that you have said about what the Greeks got from the Africans in Egypt, this question, what is classical and what is classical about Greek civilization?
Well, classical is an interesting term. It's often used to mean standard, the model, and in the 19th century, the model of excellence to which all of us should strive. And by us, it tended to mean Europeans, because only Europeans had reached this high standard, and only Europeans could reach this high standard, except for a very few lucky Asians and Africans who could assimilate thoroughly enough to take on European civilization. So that was the classical image. I've been using the term in the way it's used in history as the Greeks of the period from 500 to 300 BC, which is a high classical period from which most of the Greek literature we have comes, and most of the architecture, like the Parthenon, comes from this period. It's a high point of Greek civilization. It's then used for Rome in its high points.
Okay, let's go back to a call from the greater Washington, D.C. area. For the people, you're on the air. Good evening.
Hello.
Hello.
Could you talk about the reacceptance of the ancient model and who's willing to and who's not willing to accept it, and any personal problems you've encountered?
Well, I was working on this for...
Explain the ancient model.
Well, the ancient model I think I have explained, which is the way in which the Greeks perceived their own past as being influenced by Egypt and Phoenicia. And for 9 years, I was more or less on my own, although I got some support from the black community on this. In the last year, the situation has transformed radically, that a small press in England brought out Black Athena, and it has been very widely reviewed in England. And a surprising number of the reviews have been favorable, and none, except for one Trotskyist paper, which said I wasn't Marxist enough, have been unfavorable.
Okay, let me break in there. You said that you got support from scholars in the black community. I think it should be said that there were a number of scholars, black scholars, who were out there years ago.
Oh, yes.
Right.
That, I'm sorry, they weren't using the term ancient model, but they knew what was going on. And, of course, Dr. James...
George E.M. James.
George E.M. James was really the pioneer of the influences on classical Greece.
Okay.
But his book was not accepted. What's interesting from my point of view is that I was working on this subject for 6 years before I realized the work that had been done by black scholars in this area, that they had been shut out of the mainstream to such an extent, I just had no idea what was
You
going
said
on.
you tried to get George M. James' book, Stolen Legacy, in Cornell Library, and what happened?
Well, I knew that they wouldn't buy it, that they couldn't get, so I gave them a copy, and nothing happened. I wanted it because I wanted to set it for my students, put it on reserve for my students. Nothing happened, it had disappeared. So I gave them another copy. They're quite hard to get, but I got another, and I gave it to them. And this time, they didn't put it in the main library or in the main undergraduate library. They put it in a branch library of Cornell, that it was not considered a standard book in that way. Now, it's true, it's not the best produced book in the world, but it's got extraordinarily valuable content, and I don't think books should be treated in that way.
Okay, let me cut you. Let's take a call from the greater Washington, D.C. area. For the people, you're on the air.
Hello?
You're on the air. From South Carolina, you're on the air.
Hello, how are you today?
Fine, how are you?
Okay, I have a question. I think that Dr. Bernal,
Make it short, sir, please. We are running out of time.
along with Drs. James, Hansberry, and Diop, have established the blackness of the early Ethiopians. My question is concerning the term Semites. It has been my understanding that the Phoenicians and the Babylonians were derived from earlier Ethiopian colonies in what is now called the part of Asia. I'm wondering if Dr. Bernal would discuss that.
Well,
Just briefly.
Okay.
Go ahead.
Semitic is a linguistic, not a racial term. Herodotus, I think, is the tradition that you're basing yourself on, does say that the Phoenicians came from the Red Sea area to the south. My belief is that the language family came from Ethiopia. And here I'm a minority, but a substantial minority of Semitic scholars accept this. So that linguistically, there's very little doubt that the Semitic languages came from Africa. To what extent the population was African is much more dubious, but there were massive cultural borrowings with the language, so that in some ways Semitic speakers were African, and of course later Phoenicia was very dependent on Egypt and was heavily Egyptianized.
Okay, let's take a call from South Carolina. For the people, you're on the air.
Good afternoon. My question is the following. We have had literally millions and millions of black people growing up in this country and around the world believing that we have contributed nothing to humanity, that our whole race of people has basically been a drain on the whole human race, and we have done nothing with regard to progressing the human race. Conversely, we've obviously had millions and millions of white people growing up for generations believing just the opposite about their own history, that they are in fact the center of civilization and that everything that happened on the world of value happened because of Europeans. My question is, how do we, now that this information is really becoming, is reaching the light, how do we get it to the mainstream so that yet another generation of black people will not have to grow up the way we grew up in total ignorance of our history? How do we get it into the schools and into the minds of the millions of black people who need this for our own self-respect and self-dignity?
Thank you, ma'am. Take care.
I think that's a very important question, but I'm not sure if I'm the person who should answer it, that I'm doing what I can to present the results of my research as widely as I can, but I think it is for the educators and for the black community to take up this work and to continue the research, but more important than that even is to get the word out.
Okay, let's take a call from the greater Washington, D.C. area. For the people, you're on the air. For the people, you're on the air.
Hello?
You're on the air. How are you?
Fine.
Okay,
Not from the Washington area. I'm calling from Charleston.
that's just fine.
I'd like to refer to the work of Dr. Arthur Jensen,
Okay, just briefly, please.
who purports that, blacks are genetically inferior as far as intelligence is concerned. And I've heard a lot of information through this show to the contrary. And I'd like to know what the doctor there thinks about Dr. Jensen's study.
Okay, thank you very much.
Well, I can't speak for myself because I'm not a biologist, but every biologist I know or have read or talked to thinks it's rubbish. So I don't think it should be treated seriously in that way. Yeah.
Right now in this country, we have something that's called Black History Month. Your book says that the absence of black history can be attributed to a conscious, deliberate effort to write blacks out of history?
Well,
or
I
what?
think it's a more complicated process than that. If blacks were being maltreated so abominably, they couldn't be full human beings. And so Christians couldn't treat full human beings the way that whites were treating blacks. And therefore you had to remove the humanity from blacks in all dimensions. Now, all populations have a certain amount of antipathy towards other populations and dislike of people with different appearances. But the degree of racism that has grown up in Europe since the 17th century and since the beginning of the slave trade is completely out of proportion to this normal human feeling. And therefore, these people genuinely believed that if the Greeks said Africans had done positive things, they must be mistaken. It was an application of a systematic belief that the African was incapable of civilization, that you then had to apply this to Greek history and say, Greek history can't be the way the Greeks told it because it's unscientific.
While at the same time, these same people were dehumanizing the Africans and enslaving them.
Right.
Okay. When you consider the implications of what your book, what would you say to the black student and the white student who is assuming that because he or she is going to the University of South Carolina or Howard University or Cornell University, that he or she is getting a good education?
Well, in many ways they are getting good educations. I don't want to knock the whole university system, but on this issue, I think they're being very fundamentally misled. But one of the encouraging things I've had...
But doesn't this issue carry over into psychology?
That's true. Actually, I'm
sociology? Go ahead.
Yeah, all right. This is a particularly acute issue. But, no, of course, and I think that black and white students should be very wary in this area, that racism does seep into every pore of our society. It's such an important aspect of it that you should be wary and look out for it. And even people like me who consider myself anti-racist, I know I have racist components to my thought and feelings. I mean, it's just inevitable. You can't breathe the Northern European American air without getting it in. It's there. And so I think students should be extraordinarily careful when they study these things, particularly in ancient history. But I've been encouraged by the number of classicists, particularly young classicists, who've written to me saying, you're expressing what I've been feeling. So I think at the center of research there is now a move towards a recognition, first of all, of the Phoenician component to Greek civilization. I think it'll take stages. But from that, I think it's following through. And the positive response I've had to my book in England, of course, I'm keeping my fingers crossed about the response to it here, but leads me to believe the time is ripe for a fundamental shift of attitudes on this particular issue. I'm not saying racism is over, but I think on this particular point, it's weakening.
Let's take a call from the greater Washington, D.C. area. For the people, you're on the air.
Yes, I have one question. I'd like to congratulate you on a great series. I'm calling from Howard University.
Okay, thank you.
South Carolina Television is going to put together a dramatic series based on this kind of book. So we could see, instead of the old kind of Cleopatra and Anthony and Cleopatra, we could see a real African-type Cleopatra, so our young people can see what really happened. I think that would be a benefit to a lot.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much. To what extent did this battle over the origins of Greek civilization evolve around white men's desire to control the world's perception of the past and thereby shape all people's view of the present and the future? Are we not talking about controlling people's minds and how they see the world?
Oh, the effect, it's absolutely clear. And the terrifying thing is the way in which what is the history writing by whites for whites has affected non-whites. That most third world people and American blacks accept at some level this idea that only Europeans can really do things. I mean, it's a very effective propaganda campaign. Now, to what extent, I don't think there was a committee which set out saying, how can we rewrite history to justify imperialism and slavery?
Well,
it's a cumulative process.
But you said you had a whole university in Germany that was...
Yeah, they were trying to apply the experiences of the modern world, which is the world of European expansion to the Third World, to the study of ancient society, so that in some way the knowledge that they had gained from colonial exploitation was now being brought home.
Okay.
But there were complications. But I think the overwhelming triumph of Europe in this period fed in to this misperception of Greek history.
What do you think the future holds for the African model of origins, for the origins of Greek civilization, and the Aryan model?
Well, I'm always an optimist. I think that the Phoenician component in Greek civilization will be recognized in 5 years, and I think by the end of the century...
Why that one before the...
Because I think that the Phoenicians are related to Jews, and the Jews are being accepted.
Now, why do you say that the Phoenicians are related to Jews?
Because Phoenicians...
You said in your book that, in the introduction, that consciously, to quote you, consciously or unconsciously, European thinkers saw the Phoenicians as the Jews of antiquity. These same European thinkers probably thought, and apparently thought, that the Egyptians were white. Would you explain the relationship? Go ahead.
That's complicated because people who liked ancient Egypt, particularly the Freemasons in the 18th century, portrayed the Egyptians as white. If you accept the Egyptians as civilized, then you have to make them white. What happened in the 19th century is they took out a double insurance policy.
You got 30 seconds.
Okay. If blacks are inherently uncivilized, you've got to shut them out two ways. Egypt cannot have been black, and Egypt cannot have been civilized. So you keep them out in both ways. And the essential project was to keep Africans away from civilization.
Okay. We thank you very much for coming in, and we know that we have pushed you through this. The last time we did something on this topic, I think we took 3 hours to slowly and carefully develop it. I want to thank all our viewers in South Carolina and the greater Washington, D.C., and specifically Howard University's WHMM television, Mr. Arnold Wallace and Otha Brandon. Thank you. That's our program. Good evening.